Hello, guys, this is Kay, and you're listening to Pod Rainbow Science. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, and his influence on mental health of Americans. Here we go. Hello, guys, once again. I'm glad to have you back on the show. Thanks for tuning in. And on this freezing cold morning, I'll be talking about Mr. Donald Trump. And the thing that inspired me to do this episode was an article I read in which the author posits the hypothesis that even though Donald Trump's presidency is over for like roughly a year now, the trauma still lasts, and Americans still suffer from mental adversity stemming from his presidency and presidential campaign. And I know that many podcasters prefer to steer clear of politics and balance somewhere between left and right wing. I'm not going to do it. I don't want this podcast to be too political, but I'm usually pretty explicit about my political leaning, so I have to declare that I'm definitely left winger. And I believe in liberty. I believe in national health insurance. I believe in equal marriage. However, I don't believe in marriage at all. If you want me to say something more about me, write me an email. I'll explain it to you, and I'll explain it how it works. Okay, but what do politicians have to do with mental health? And especially mental health of LGBTQ people. The relationship comes in two forms, the direct one and indirect one. And to describe both forms of this relationship, we have to introduce the notion such as vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma was first described in the context of psychotherapists who worked with clients with PTSD or other difficulties related to traumatic experience. And scientists and therapy supervisors observed that the counselors who worked with such clients after some time began to present the symptoms that usually occur after the exposure to traumatic events. So that, for instance, counselors who worked with people after sexual victimization started to present anxiety, generalized fear, helplessness. Even though they themselves never experienced anything traumatic, either recently or at all. And their trauma reactions were secondary to their exposure to client symptoms. And vicarious trauma quickly gained the attention of social psychologists who started to explore the issue. And after years of research in many social contexts, it was just a matter of time to someone bring up the scientific question, what about LGBTQ people? And indeed, someone asked this question, and people conducted research one after another, verifying if such effect is visible in other minority groups in the context of public speeches, public figures presenting their opinion, news presenting other gay people both embraced and disgraced, and so forth. And the concept of vicarious trauma has evolved throughout the years. So obviously, vicarious trauma concerning rainbow population is at least to a degree different than this one experienced by therapists, but the core is exactly the same. Watching other people being affected by the traumatic event affect us directly. And if those are the people we relate to or identify with, the vicarious trauma takes its toll in a very tangible way. So in the case of LGBTQ people, paradoxically, the more negative incidents of violence, bullying, and discrimination are shown in the news or in social media, the greater exacerbation of mental health is visible among members of this group. And so far, it is not clear what is better, whether to show it or not show it. I'm also in two minds about it, because on one hand, showing how people are being discriminated, how their rights are being taken away, or how they are denied going to by now proms with someone of the same sex, it all increases vicarious trauma and has negative effect on other LGBTQ people. But on the other hand, those people who experience such negative events need to be supported, and we can't let them all alone. And the media, whether TV, newspapers, on social media, are currently the best way to quickly inform public opinion on what's going on. So I don't have a clear answer to this dilemma. And possibly the best example of this effect is the whole body of research on LGBTQ or people mental health after Orlando shooting. And I believe you've all heard about it, so I'm not gonna explain all the situation. But for those of you who for some reason never heard of Orlando, I'll just give a brief overview. On June 12th, 2016, an armed man entered into the Pulse Club in Orlando, Florida, and opened fire to people who were inside. Pulse was a gay nightclub where many LGBTQ people were partying, and on that tragic night, 49 persons were killed and other 53 were injured. And that was, according to reports, the deadliest example of targeted violence toward lesbians, gays, bisexual, and gender diverse people in the United States. The victims of this shooting were predominantly sexually diverse men from Latinx communities. And the news broke worldwide, absolutely. From Los Angeles to Canberra, people were gathering in their local community spots to show support to each other. And overall, that was a terrible night and terrible days after the shooting, and nothing can bring back those lives, nor ease the pain of their families. But if we can do one thing for them, or learn anything from this terrible lesson, we must use such events to better understand the situation of other LGBTQ people. So that's why scientists took up the vicarious trauma and other trauma-related issues and conducted research to provide help and improve support of LGBTQ people who were directly or indirectly affected by this event. And two researchers from Nashville, Tennessee, Kyle Gavalik, I hope this is how it's read, and Gilbert Gonzalez analyzed how this event affected sexual minority people in terms of mental health. And I will, of course, upload the link to their paper in the description. They did very well job analyzing the population-based data and found that there was a significant impact of Orlando shooting on severe psychological distress on sexual diverse men, but not sexually diverse women. And by significant effect, I'm talking about approximately 25% increase. So one more time. Severe psychological distress in sexually minority men increased by more than 25%. That is a huge peak. And Gavalik and Gonzalez further argue that this impact is smaller for women. However, as I told you before, the vicarious trauma work with greater intensity when we are identified with the group that is affected by trauma. And since the majority of victims were bisexual and gay men of color, we could expect men to be more affected and distressed. This is basically how it works. And I hope you get the correct idea of what it is. And now, after this quite lengthy digression, which actually turns out to be an introduction, we can go back to Trump's presidency and his influence on people. I guess you all remember the whole campaign before Donald Trump won. And I have to admit that I could say the same thing about any right-wing candidate. I could say it about Putin, I could say it about Bolsonaro, or about Andrzej Duda, our current president. All of them were against marriage equality, all of them were against LGBTQ community, all of them were talking trash about sexual minority people. And the reason I'm talking about Trump is that his presidency is the most vivid and recognized example of such phenomenon. But okay, back to track. I'm sure you'll remember the tapes on which Trump was explicit about sexual misconduct or abuse. You remember how he treated and what he was talking about women. You remember his endeavor in removing transgender persons from sex discrimination law and so forth. And all those acts of him and his administration took a serious toll on sexual minority people. And politicians and public figures, even though they often don't realize it, they have a profound impact on people's lives, both positive and negative. And there is a reason why they are called persons of public trust, sometimes, yet sometimes unreasonably. But such public statements made on sexual minority people or acting against them through limiting their rights, or cutting financial support for transgender people, or taking away protection law, lead to enormous increase in people's internalized homophobia and fear, and also increased risk of developing mental health issues. And on the other hand, it encourages hostile groups and people to act against certain groups of people because they feel doing so is absolutely legitimate. In the process of making America great again, Trump's administration overlooked that it's becoming much worse for many groups, including women, immigrants, people of color, people with disabilities, sexual minority groups, and many, many other people. So basically, America is supposed to be great, but only for white, rich, cisgender, and straight men. And many researchers underline that such rhetoric is harmful and increases the risk of discrimination and surge in violent acts targeted to minority groups. And subsequently, after several months, and later after several years of Trump's presidency, those researchers tried to verify whether they were right or not. And guess what? All or almost all of their predictions were right. The number of violence acts increased. Women and members of varied minority groups reported increase on mental distress and anxiety and generalized fear. Even straight and white people reported they felt anxious about the uncertain situations of Planned Parenthood facilities since, states got the power to withhold funds from abortion services. And now you see what's going on in Texas, for example. And you may think that many of his and his administration's decisions don't have an impact on people or have an impact only on a small number of people. But it is not entirely true. When people are living in the environment which they perceive as hostile or threatening, their cognitive abilities are severely abused. And cognitive abilities cognitive ability actually in general is mind's ability to analyze the environment, to put it in the most simple way I could. So cognitive abilities enable us to have memories, to acquire knowledge. They enable reasoning and calculating in our head and so on. But cognitive abilities also have a serious limitation, which is limitation, indeed. Researchers even compared our cognitive abilities to the computer's memory. Like every computer is working memory and random access memory and processing power and so on. And when you want to do too much at once, some computer fail to do so and stop responding. And the same thing is going on with our cognitive abilities. When we receive too much information and we have to process them all at once, and especially when information we get is negative, and negative information requires deeper processing and uses more of our cognitive reserve, our brain stops responding and give us the signs that this is just too much. And the thing is that from an evolutionary standpoint, this process was efficient. And when people 100 years ago encountered threats, all of their cognitive reserves had to process those threats quickly and unable to think on their feet. It was like a sink or swim situation. You fight or flight, and that's it. In the modern world, we're not bothered by wild animals or fire or thunders, and consequently, our brain considers different things as stressful. And those could be, for instance, final insecurity, disease or serious medical condition, wars or armed conflicts, and so forth. But still, brain works in more or less similar way. It tends to focus on what's perceived to be threatening, even though we are aware that we cannot do anything about it, and even though we are aware that we should focus on something different, like our work, our education, relationship, or anything. And I guess you can easily imagine that when you argue with someone in the morning, you can't really focus on your work during the day, even though you know you should. Or when you experience something unpleasant or expect to experience something unpleasant the next day, you can't sleep at all, or you can't sleep well, or you have troubles with falling asleep, and so on. That's because your cognitive system is overloaded, just like the processor in a computer. And going one step further into this process, we'll find out that this cognitive overload can work subconsciously, like beyond our consciousness. So it is using our cognitive abilities, make a use of our cognitive resources, but even when we are not aware that this process is going on. Even when we're not thinking about it, because obviously we're not constantly thinking about marriage inequality or racism or workplace discrimination. It is just somewhere in the back of our mind, and it's using our cognitive reserves, but we don't think about it. We don't process it consciously. And coming back to the computer system, we can compare it to, for instance, firewall. It's working beyond our control. We don't turn it on deliberately, but it's using computer's memory. And sometimes when you have a slow computer, all this process can make it crash or something. So this is basically the mechanism of how the relationship between law and mental health are related, and research seems to support this issue. For instance, Brian Ogolski conducted a longitudinal analysis of the relationship between marriage equality and mental health, and we like, or even we love, longitudinal analysis because, contrary to the cross-sectional studies, in longitudinal ones, we can observe the change over time, not only at a certain time point. And Ogolski compared same-sex couples living in the states with and without marriage equality and observed their well-being while the states were transitioning to marriage equality. And he found out that something was obvious. The same-sex couples who lived in states with marriage equality reported higher rates of family support, lower levels of stigma, and they were generally doing better. But the second major finding of this research is even more interesting. He observed that in those states which transitioned to marriage equality, mental distress and self-reported stigma of same-sex couples decreased over time, and family acceptance slightly increased. And by the way, this increase of family support drew my attention, especially because I couldn't quite figure out why it happened. Like what? Like when they finally got married or they planned to get married, their family thought something like, "Oh crap, this is serious now. We can't help it." Or what happened? What happened that they became more accepting toward lesbian gay family members? I have no idea, and you have any idea how it worked, let me know, please, because I'm super curious about it. But besides this crazy effect of family, the visible effect of marriage equality and mental distress was underlined, and it shows that law and institutional protection play a significant role in alleviating individuals' distress and increasing individuals' well-being, and so that is also for straight people, transitioning to equality is worth doing. Why? Because LGBTQ people are less burdened, they can learn more effectively, they can work better, they don't require as much support and help as they do when they feel abused in terms of discrimination and so on. And I'm thinking of the long cascade of consequences that inequality causes. and I can really multiply them on and on, like LGBTQ people who need medical support and treatment due to long-term consequences of stigma, and when stigma is low, the treatment is more accessible to other people. Or there is a necessity for LGBTQ non-profit organizations to fight stigma, while if stigma wasn't so common, those people could engage in other forms of support, such as working in NGOs that overcome climate change or support children with troubles in learning and so on. Or I know LGBTQ people who need psychotherapy, and where when there wasn't such a load of stigma, those therapists could provide help to other people in need, and so on and so on. Like, or LGBTQ people who suffer depressive disorder or anxiety, they have to skip at least a few days or even a few months a year not working. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that when there's no stigma, all those people could be healthy and happy and all the problems disappear. It's not so easy. But what I'm saying is that when there is no stigma or there is less stigma, many people would benefit. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump, if he wasn't president, LGBTQ people wouldn't suffer. No. But what I'm saying, and it's not only me who's saying it, LGBTQ people during Donald Trump's presidency suffered greater load of distress compared to the previous years. And for example, Masanori Kuroki did a great analysis of mental distress, or actually extreme mental distress among LGBTQ people during Trump's presidency. And he underlines that Donald Trump wasn't the first and the only president who opposed same-sex marriage and who was against LGBTQ people in general. And I'm sure he wasn't the last one. So the conclusions can be generalized broader. But what he found? Kuroki analyzed the behavioral risk factor surveillance system survey collected every year between 2014 and 2019. The survey is a household level survey collected by the Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health. And the question is why since 2014 and not previous years? Because since 2014, data on gender and sexual identity was available. In 2012, 2013, it wasn't accessible. Kuroki observed that incidents of extreme physical violence toward LGBT people started rising in March of 2016 when Donald Trump became the frontrunner, and these incidents or number of these incidents was increasing until November when he was elected for the president of the United States. But the extreme mental distress increased in March 2016, remained higher during the preceding year, and in November 2016, when Donald Trump became the president, it started increasing gradually, but only in LGBT people. In the group of straight people, the level of extreme mental distress hasn't changed. And one more interesting thing is that the increase of distress among LGBT people was most visible in the red states, so those which were more Republican states. Those who identified as non-straight or non-cisgender and lived in the states where Donald Trump won, those people presented greater increase in extreme mental distress. And I myself live in a country where the government is extremely hostile toward LGBTQ people. They oppose marriage equality, they oppose easing process for transgender people, they oppose abortion procedures, they reject the recognition of marriage certificate given abroad, and so on. So if you're married to a person of the same sex in the United States or in Germany or in Netherlands, and you come to Poland, you are virtually single here. So you can marry other person. That's technically how it works. So I can easily relate to people who live in the Republican states. But I also know that there are many great and straight people who believe in marriage equality and social equality. And those people, shoulder to shoulder with us, are marching in pride parades, are protesting against discrimination and line up against social exclusion. And I believe we all together can gradually change the world for better. It it just takes time and effort and perseverance. And I'm going to leave you with this message today. Wish you all a great day and great week. And until next time. And thank you for your messages on Twitter. And thank you for 2 mails I got. Take care and bye.